My name is Brandy Hofstetter. I graduated from South Hunterdon in 2010. I went to Lambertville Public School for my elementary school schooling, and it was difficult to navigate as a kid in a wheelchair because I was the only kid in a wheelchair at that time. A lot of issues of accessibility got pushed onto me to deal with as an individual. The awkwardness and the figuring out always landed on my shoulders, and that's way too much for a kid to carry. The bathrooms were not accessible, and there was, I think, 2 accessible entrances to the school, and the rest of the entrances/exits I couldn't utilize. And so there was moments of friction of movement in everyday life that just added more time onto my schedule, and that I was responsible for rerouting and figuring out. Now that I'm older, looking back, it's easy to see that those daily moments of friction of movement had a huge impact on the amount of time that I would be in class and what my expectations were for myself of being in class on time and being fully participating in class, but also teachers' expectations of me to be on time. And I think because those accessibility issues were just accepted, that it was also accepted that I wouldn't be in class on time and I wouldn't be fully participating in class. I didn't even learn how to ask for what I needed as a child as far as accessibility needs because I was never granted that in my everyday environment. The way a fire drill was practiced at LPS was when we would do a fire drill, all of the other kids would be let out of the room by the teacher, and I was instructed to wait in the room for another teacher or someone previously designated to come help me out of the room. And that was because every classroom at LPS had to step out the back door. And because I was inaccessible, then I wouldn't be going with the rest of the kids. It was obviously unsafe. If there was a real fire, I suppose I would just be considered a loss. And like the reality that I experienced was that like my safety was not important either, and that it could be designated as something to figure out afterwards. When you build these environments that are inaccessible, you also create a lot of events of inaccessibility and exclusion that have bigger impacts, like in my understanding of safety and even knowing what to do in those situations. That I think is also not a realistic direction of what a disabled person should do in the event of a fire or any situation. The inaccessibility that I experienced as a child at these schools definitely had long-term impacts on me. It laid a foundational narrative about the importance of including people with disabilities in everyday life, which when you are disabled, moving through spaces that are built exclusively for able-bodied people means that inclusion of disabled people is not important, right? And that accessibility is something for a disabled person to figure out themselves. The referendum is important to me because it changes the narrative of the importance of disabled people in society. And that's something that I started learning when I was a child, that it felt like our alienation was acceptable. And now that this referendum is coming up and removing those accessibility barriers, that to me rewrites the history of what's important, who's important to include in a school environment.